goodness. Well, first of all, I want to thank all the organizers of this occasion, and I feel deeply honored by your having arranged it, and deeply touched as well, and also invigorated by many of the things that I hear on the panels today and which I hope to hear tomorrow. I'm also very, very touched by David's remarks, and I know now that I have at least one extremely friendly, excessive obituary readily written, and for that I'm grateful. So I won't take too long. Is it possible to have this light on as well? Because yeah, good. So I will read this lecture to you, which really came out of something that I was asked to do about a year ago, to revisit this article, which apparently people have read and reread. I don't know why, but still, called The Idea of an Anthropology of Islam. And I wrote it, and I gave it about a week ago in Washington, the paper that you're about to hear. And after that, I realized that I hadn't really read that paper for years and years and years, because it was written nearly 30 years ago, as perhaps some of you know, The Idea of an Anthropology of Islam. And I was surprised to find, as I skimmed through it, that the idea that is very often cited or invoked by all sorts of people in it, and that is the idea of tradition, actually comes towards the very end in just a few pages. And I thought, my goodness, I thought I'd said an awful lot about it, but I hadn't, of course. So what I want to do tonight is to take up that concept, and which is central, nevertheless, to that paper, however brief, and to explore it further tonight and see where we go. I might just fall over the cliff, of course, David. I don't know where we are going, but still. Now, one of the things I think I want to say is that I use the term tradition in that lecture to signify two things that I now think I should distinguish much more explicitly and see their connections. Discursivity and embodiment. I mean, they're there, but somehow I think it needed to be said much more straightforwardly and elaborated. So the two are, of course, connected in the minutiae of everyday life and through various temporalities, but I think they need to be distinguished for analytical purposes. Embodied tradition is a way of changing oneself over time, as I understand it, of acquiring through language aptitudes, sensibilities, and propensities until language itself becomes redundant. Typically, embodied tradition expresses a desire for attachment to and completion of a present that's simply unfinished time. Embodied tradition has times of beginning, of growth and completion, times of finitude and weakness, times of hope and despair. In discursive tradition, by contrast, humans and objects tend to inhabit linear time, being moved forward indefinitely and at a more abstract level, reflecting on realities outside as well as of oneself. Now, some critics have recently argued for real experience as against abstract theory, and there's been a certain amount of concern about that. But this epistemological binary doesn't really interest me at least not in this paper. The experience that I want to focus on in my exploration of tradition is adjectival, as in sentences like an experienced mountaineer, or an experienced actor, or an experienced soldier. Both discursive and embodied tradition encapsulate a sense of lived time. Tradition, I should add, doesn't, in the way in which I think of it, define a world. It is a location in and orientation to it. Texts that found discursive tradition aren't exhaustive because other texts, or oral traditions for that matter, that deal with behavior and interpretation become part of those foundations, illuminating and developing them. In any living tradition, there are arguments about whether exegetical texts or texts belonging to other traditions are authoritative, and if so, why? These arguments and exchanges indicate that founding texts are moments in ongoing conversations. So, in principle, tradition can accommodate rupture, recuperation, reorientation, and splitting, as well as continuity. For individuals, of course, there are not only continuities, but also exits and entries. But in a critical sense, both discursive and embodied traditions are given and not invented. Thus, when reform is proposed by somebody who has a tradition and wants to reform it, there is an assumption, explicit or implicit, that its essence must be preserved through reinterpretation or rearrangement. It's through questions of time and authority, as articulated by the idea of tradition, that I want to think about politics in Egypt today. But I begin by discussing how some followers of Islamic tradition invoke and expound it, and note the antipathy toward the tradition by self-styled secularists. I then ask how the notion of sovereignty, that is, sovereignty both of the subject and the state, in our globalized world, makes it difficult for embodied tradition to flourish. Over the last several decades, before the recent coup, whenever I visited Egypt, I often heard criticisms of the so-called Islamic awakening, or Sahwa. The critics regard themselves as modern, and so signs of what they identify as religion in public offend them. What they found offensive wasn't directly political. Their anxiety was focused on two aspects, it seemed to me, of what they saw as the danger of religion to politics. On the one hand, the fastidious emphasis on ritual as evidence of blind obedience to authority, and therefore antipathetic to the autonomous modern self. On the other hand, laying claim to the right to display religious belonging publicly posed a risk to national unity, since national politics is, or should be, based on reasoned arguments about collective interests. The criticisms my friends had of Islamic tradition echo a historical debate about religion since the early Enlightenment that's partly based on a new psychology that emerged in Europe in early modernity. A psychology focusing on such interior states as sincerity, authenticity, and the will, and claiming a clear-cut antithesis between freedom and authority. Since the 17th century, ritual has been spoken of very much as tradition has. It looks to the past as continuous and unchanging. It consists of formal and inauthentic action. It's based on non-rational thought. It reflects submission of the will to authority. It prioritizes social convention over personal sincerity and freedom of action. This view was epitomized in the Protestant rejection of Catholic ritualism, eventually to become modern common sense. The assumption that tradition is anti-modern can be and has been countered in several ways. Thus, Adam Seligman and his colleagues have recently argued that the formal character of ritual has the function of smoothing social life, where a rigid adherence to one's actual feelings, that is, being sincere, would seriously disturb it. The theoretical object of ritual and tradition is therefore not the expression of feeling or meaning, but the management of feeling by the use of established formalisms. Again, another instance of this questioning. The principle of precedent embodied in tradition is also known to be crucial to modern law. In both common law and the principle of stare decisis, the legal reasoning in prior judicial decisions is followed unless there are very strong reasons to do otherwise. Finally, respectful attention to the objects, texts, buildings, and landscapes that have survived from the past become valuable evidence in the present for reconstructing that past as effectively as possible, and a critical assessment of such evidence is essential to the making of veridical historical narratives. So discursive fidelity to the past, one might say, is central to the modern discipline of history. And yet, you might object, none of this surely proves that religion should have a place in modern politics, even if some forms of tradition are nevertheless necessary to modern life. Some continuity with the past may be necessary because it facilitates social intercourse, or because it provides a measure of predictability to the law and therefore to the state, but religious tradition bases itself on unquestionable authority, whereas democratic politics requires public argument capable of being brought to a rational conclusion. Now, I'll return to this and other liberal claims about politics later, but first I want to talk a little about the Islamic concept of tradition so that it might help us think about the time and authority of politics in Egypt today, however sketchily and minimally. In 2009, I was in Cairo and had weekly conversations with the Khatib of the Sultan Hassan Mosque, Sheikh Osama Sayyid al-Azhari. I was particularly interested in how he understood the Islamic tradition. He talked about the education of good character through the practices of devotion and discipline, but insisted that the ethical formation of the individual as a human being could not be a matter for the individual alone, that it takes place through interactions among people and things in several social locations, as he put it: household, school, mosque, the media, and the street. In each location, there were proper and improper ways of behaving and interacting with others, behavior that had to be learnt. It was not simply that practice mattered, it was that learning to practice aptly what had been learnt in the past that was crucial. What was critical in traditional devotion, according to him, was not only initial guidance by an authoritative teacher, whether parent or sheikh, but its perfectibility. It was in this exercise of the soul, as Ghazali put it, that spiritual orientations and sensibilities could be learnt and recognized. Thus, repetition of the same paradoxically creates a difference, transmuting vice into virtue and also inability into ability. What Sheikh Osama was saying about embodied tradition was not, therefore, to be confused with self-fashioning, a process well known in the ancient world and revived in the European Renaissance. Christian thought and practice had rejected self-making from the beginning and developed an alternative in monastic discipline that taught willing submission. Augustine expressed this rejection in a memorable warning. "Hands off yourself," he said. "Try to build up yourself and you build a ruin." The individual, in other words, shouldn't imagine that he or she was sovereign. It should be stressed, however, that the doctrine of obedience wasn't unqualified, which is sometimes forgotten, because opposition to false claims of authority was itself an essential form of obedience. The Islamic tradition shares this doctrine with Christianity and has developed it even more vigorously. This should not be surprising, incidentally, because Islam developed in late antiquity in a world where Byzantine and Sasanian empires ruled and Christian, Judaic and Mazdaean traditions flourished, and so, as Muslims interacted with non-Muslims, they inherited institutions and ideas from that complex history and went on to develop them in diverse but distinctive ways. But with the growth of commercial society, the possibilities of self-invention have opened up for much of the population and been justified as the right of the sovereign self. However, many critics have pointed out that that form of embodiment is based on the illusion of sovereignty because and to the extent that the individual's behavior is an obedient response to the call of the market. According to this critical view, the market, like any coercive force, requires consumers to submit. This formulation, however, isn't entirely persuasive because it runs counter to most people's feeling and experience of free choice in the market. The assumption that underlies the disciplines of embodied tradition, whether of Augustine or Ghazali, come from a different direction. The assumption that coercion can also be internal, and therefore one is not simply free if external coercion is absent. This is expressed in the idea, ancient as well as modern, that one is a prisoner of one's emotions, hence the notion passion, from which one can be freed only by reason, hence the notion of action, which is where one is in control, as it were. What Sheikh Osama was trying to describe, therefore, was thus more interesting than what the critics in Cairo I cited earlier complained about. What he sought to convey was the idea of intention itself being constituted in the repeated acts of body and mind within a social context. In fact, like the mastery of all grammar, the ability to perform devotions well, or as it said, to be devout, required not only repetition, but also flexibility in different circumstances. It was not simply a matter of acting as in the past, but of acquiring a capability for which the past was a beginning. Sheikh Osama insisted that there was a social dimension to the disciplines of devotion, as is the traditional duty of every Muslim to urge what's good and oppose what is reprehensible. Amr bil ma'ruf, of course, wa nahy an al-munkar, including advice and warning, that is nasiha. What I found intriguing about his discourse was his attempt to tie Amr bil ma'ruf to the virtue of friendship. Suhbah and ikhwa and muashara were terms that he used, in fact, to present it as a matter of responsibility and concern for a friend rather than of policing. The language and attitude in which one carries out that duty were integral to what Amr bil Ma'ruf was. According to Sheikh Osama, a just society was possible only if its individual members learnt the virtues through tradition and were helped to do so by relatives, teachers, and friends. Even if you meet a stranger, he said, you should behave towards him as though he were a friend, unless you have good reason not to do so. One could reprove a person kindly, he said, but if urging him to reform fail to produce a positive result, one should boycott him until he changes, because this is the duty of friendship. One implication here, although Sheikh Osama didn't articulate it, is that speaking or acting harshly may sometimes be necessary to make someone listen. 5 years after I met Sheikh Osama, Abdul Mun'im Abul Futtuh, who was a presidential candidate in 2012, invoked the tradition of Amr bil Ma'ruf himself explicitly in answer to one of my questions about the uprising and the coup and the role of Egyptian religiosity in those events. And I quote from him, "This religiosity," he said, "is a definite fact. The Egyptian personality includes deep faith and devotion to the sacred, and a sense of considerable interpenetration between everyday life and the sacred. But this religiosity isn't always accompanied by a social, political, and legal consciousness, and sometimes it's merely formal or superficial or ritual. The importance of religiosity in the 25th January 2011 revolution was that it formed the moral background to the conscience of the revolution, even if its discourse didn't display that clearly. As for the events of 3rd July and later, the powerful propaganda that preceded 3rd July joined in distorting and treating with contempt the Islamists in preparation for the events of 3rd July and after. And the matter reached the point of doubting even what is sacred. This was what weakened the values and meanings of fundamental religiosity that forbids the shedding of blood and commands what is right and forbids what is wrong and tyrannical. And so millions of people confirmed and excused and supported ugly behavior that was without historical precedent. So here was where superficial religiosity failed because of its separation from values and norms." Unquote. This was all from Abdul Mun'im. So Abdul Mun'im's reference to the massacres of pro-Mursi protesters by the military regime extends the Amr bil Ma'ruf into a political context. But it's political in a direct sense, as a condemnation of collective cruelty. Whereas, I would suggest, Amr bil Ma'ruf could also be political in another sense, seen as political in another sense. That is, in helping someone to acquire virtues relevant for politics, and not as an institution of the state, which I will come to later on, but rather in relation to the idea that Sheikh Osama suggested of friendship. So let me turn now to the January 2011 uprising and what followed it. In what sense can those events be seen in terms of tradition, I ask myself. The uprising expressed an aspiration to bring down the system and make a new beginning, a democratic tradition that would flow from that beginning. But of course, a beginning never guarantees the hoped-for future. Alertness, imagination, and argument are required to respond to the various threats and opportunities opened up in starting a democratic tradition. Paradoxically, the first weakening of the promise of a new beginning in the January uprising was the army's deposition of Mubarak. Most activists were delighted at what they saw as a solidarity of the army with the people. Eid Wahid was one of the slogans at the time, but which the army generals saw, I think, more clearly as a first step in an orderly transition. What many observers missed, I think, was that it was not the uprising that undermined state authority, but the weakening of state authority that allowed the uprising to explode. And it was the rebels' failure to recognize that fact that I think gave them an exaggerated sense of their own power and led to their failure to distinguish between friends and enemies. When the state's authority crumbled, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces stepped in and slowly rebuilt it. When people talked about a transitional period, there was therefore some confusion of the time required for realizing the people's will with the time for restoring the sovereign state's majesty and forcefulness. Much was talked about the Haybat al-Dawla at the time, because both times concerned the legitimacy of political rule. Arguments about political legitimacy have raged in Egypt after July 2013 coup, although it was not always clear how those who made the claims and counterclaims saw the relationship of legitimacy to legality, a relationship which is in any case not very easy to define. Max Weber's famous classification of political authority, what he called legitimate domination, which is famous in the social sciences, is one of the most famous definitions, he classified this into three ideal types. This gives only one of them a basis in legality. That is what he called the rational legal. The basis of the other two, which he called respectively tradition and charisma, have nothing to do with legality. The latter being a kind of, if you like, revolutionary legitimacy, and the former being an unthinking attachment, for Weber, of the past, to the past. Growth is its primary function, and rulers thus become receptive to arguments for privatization and marketization. And it's the continuous dislocation effected by the logic of the market that renders, as I said before, embodied tradition increasingly precarious. The solidarity enabled by market-promoted fashion, by the way, are not to be confused with the embodied traditions, because fashion, as everybody knows, is ephemeral, like things in the market, but increasingly are. As in other parts of the modern globe, the idea of freedom in Egypt has merged with the idea of the free market, expressed, for example, in the Supreme Constitutional Court's reforms of the bureaucratic laws held to be keeping back private enterprise. In the period of economic and political liberalization, a plethora of NGOs has created an expanding space of what's called civil society. Middle-class activists with institutional funding from Euro-America and entry to Western networks seek to teach fellow citizens to claim their rights as free individuals from their state and to produce more efficiently in a free economy. One result has been that this civil society has become further alienated from the predicament of the urban and rural poor. Market time, with its emphasis on the sovereign consumer, not only undermines much of the continuity of everyday life, the ephemeral character, as I said, of fashion, but also disrupts the time necessary for democratic deliberation. Over the last few decades, the increasing circulation of money from rentier income has contributed to rapid social mobility that's helped undermine past solidarities and commitments and created the individualist aspirations and resentments at the failure to realize those aspirations. Several years ago, the prominent Egyptian social critic and political economist Talal Asad bewailed what he saw as a change in people's behavior. Promise-keeping, pride in one's work, and loyalty to old relationships are, he wrote, now rarely valued. Hisham al-Hamami, advisor to Abdul Mun'im, Abul Futtuh, cites an expression to describe what he sees as the growing self-interest in society. And that is, Gildi wa Gaibi, which some of you may have heard of, my skin in my pocket. That is, all that matters is what affects my body and my money. The space of genuine friendship, critics say, is disappearing, and with the growth of consumerism, deepening cultural differences and life chances grow too. Continuity with the past, which is essential to friendship, is devalued. When some people speak of growing corruption in Egyptian society, it is the sovereign self they claim to see emerging everywhere. And when others welcome the modernization, albeit uneven, of Egypt, its individual autonomy, economic efficiency, and indifference to religious identity that they point to, a new form of governmentality has emerged. Hostility to the presence of religion in the public sphere seems to be largely based on the idea that it would be reactionary and divisive, that it would rely on the absolute authority of the past rather than on the self-governing individual's capacity for reason. And yet, religion, unsurprisingly, has not been excluded from the state. Thus, Azhar has acquired an increasingly public role in the post-coup era, working in close collaboration with the Ministry of Religious Endowments. The present Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar, Ahmed al-Tayyib, aspires not only to greater prominence in the public domain, but also to greater collaboration with the state in the extended regulation of mosques, preachers, Islamic research centers, some university faculties, and so on. And he seeks to project an Islam which he calls appropriate to the 21st century. That Islam, more often referred to as moderate or liberal Islam, is clearly one that recognizes itself as being a force in the exercise of sovereign power, an instrument of modern sovereignty. So Sheikh Ali Gum'a, previous Grand Mufti of Egypt, denounces the Muslim Brotherhood as a sectarian minority, as heretics, as Khawarij, as the dogs of hellfire, Kilabun Nar, and so on, and therefore as deserving of slaughter by the military protectors of the nation. I stress this not as an example of religious violence. All states use violence, although their styles differ, but of compatibility of theological discourse within the modern state. One of the questions I have raised in my talk is why liberals in Egypt seek to exclude religion from the political space. And the short, familiar answer is, liberals tend to see the future as the continuous progress of mankind led by the secular state, in which tradition is an outmoded attachment to the past, and a past that must be overcome. But there's another connected problem that's often overlooked. Many critics have an understandable concern at the attempts to impose an Islamic personality on a country containing diverse traditions and identities. But the crucial question is not why an Islamic identity should or should not be imposed on Egypt, but what it is about the modern state that seems to require a homogeneous political identity. The modern state seeks a singular personality for itself in the exercise of sovereignty, and claims that this is necessary for the unity and modernization of its subjects. The desire to preserve the unity of the people rests on a political metaphysic that is shared by liberals and Islamists alike, a metaphysic that underpins the modern concept of sovereignty in the state. The belief that there is such a thing as a homogeneous nation, that a homogeneous nation should be represented by a state, and that the state must reflect the nation's singular personality. And this is the idea, of course, together with that of political minorities, which becomes important only with the arrival of modern sovereign statehood. One may recall here a remark Michel Foucault once made in relation to the Iranian Revolution. I quote from him, "Concerning the expression Islamic government, why cast immediate suspicion on the adjective Islamic? The word government suffices," he says, "in itself to awaken vigilance," unquote. Now, critics of Foucault have taken his comment, which is in fact relating to the so-called Islamic Republic, have taken his comments on Iran as evidence of his romance with political Islam. But they are mistaken, in my view. He is posing a question about the modern state's practice of sovereignty. For the modern state is held together by technologies of power and instrumental knowledge, not by moral ideals and general consent. For Foucault, the genealogy of the modern state is to be found not in legal constitutional histories, but in the evolution of the concept and practice of politics as an autonomous apparatus of control over the life of an entire society through the state. To the extent that sustained unity has any coherent sense, it comes from embodied tradition, I would maintain, from the shared past and present practices that define the life of those who belong to a community. The modern sovereign territorial state can't have the unity of a tradition, because the lives of people within it are too disparate in the things they value in order to form a real community. It's precisely because of this diversity that democracy presents itself as an assemblage of political and legal devices for addressing the ineradicable presence of difference, disagreements, and even mutual antipathy in the modern state with a minimum of damage, and why skills and sensibilities required to engage democratically must be acquired by the experience of tradition, both discursive and embodied. And of course it is, in my view, quite wrong to imagine that democracy is all about unity. It isn't, on the contrary. So instead of responding to the question, a secular or a religious state, which is still lively in certain hidden quarters in Egypt, one might try to imagine what politics not focused on the sovereign territorial state might look like. If one did so, one would need to draw on older ideas that have been pushed out of the narrative of secular progress since pre-modern times, such as the absence of rigid territorial boundaries and so on. The primary question is how far rights and duties attaching to civil status can be negotiated, just as they now are in international law. But whereas the latter regulates relations among sovereign states, one might think of a plurality of groupings, each with its own institutional order and purpose, but often overlapping in membership and or territory, engaged in negotiation. Some authorities would be subsidiary to others for narrowly defined purposes, but none would have the comprehensiveness and finality claimed by the sovereign territorial state. Among these authorities would be a variety of traditions, defined not by bounded territory or by exclusive membership, but embedded in networks of commercial, cultural, spiritual, and intellectual relations, extending unevenly beyond various borders, an arrangement that some have called a commonwealth. One could belong non-exclusively to a people without thinking that it must therefore complete itself by having its own territorial state. Thus, even the notion of ummah, which is very much talked about nowadays, which usually signifies a people, also has, and it's sometimes forgotten, a Quranic sense of ethical formation and commitment. The idea of numerous non-hierarchical domains of normativity opens up the possibility of a very different kind of politics and of policies. that would always have to address numerous interlinked bodies. Democratic procedures to deal with differences and disagreements would include civil pressures directed against authorities, including civil disobedience, to make governance accountable. Something like the tradition of Amr bil Ma'ruf, not connected with any central power or authority, could form programs of subject formation as well as incitement to protest against political power. There would be neither the authority nor the technical ability of state apparatuses to impose a single legal order. It would be impossible to aim at capturing state power or to impose a single identity when there is no state. In sum, if state sovereignty were to be replaced by more complex forms of authority, time, and belonging, neither secularism nor political Islam would have any raison d'être. Of course, one may point to what one thinks of as a better future, what I think of as a better future, but getting there is quite another matter. Given the world we live in, the mere suggestion that sovereignty be abandoned borders on fantasy. Today, no state accepts the violation of its sovereign right, although that is precisely what happens to weak states that are unable to do much about it. For in practice, there are rights overriding the principle of sovereignty that only powerful states can exercise. Thus, the US and Israel insist on their right to use preemptive violence against another state or against a foreign population on grounds of self-defense, as well as of the duty to intervene by force in another state in order to protect a population against imminent massacre by its own rulers or by sectarian elements whom the state is unwilling or unable to restrain. But all sovereign states are invested in the continuous search for global markets, for investment capital, and military security, and driven by the ever-present desire for increasing profit, consumption, and power under the auspices of various international corporations. It's this excess generated by continuous unstoppable desire that embodied traditions sought to restrain, even if often it failed to do so. But in our world, the sovereign individual and the sovereign state, each reflecting the other, neither able to change the world for the better, are both, in my view, trapped. That's the tragedy, I think, not merely of Egypt, but of our time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Asad. Professor Asad will take some questions, so please, there is a microphone.
No, there's somebody there with a hand up, I think. One person there. So. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. There's so much to think about, but I guess, and I have this half-formed question about the binary, in a sense, that you draw between the market and the state, but I maybe want to leave that aside for a while now, and to actually work with the idea of the sovereign self and its relationship with the market and with tradition. And to play the devil's advocate, I'm just trying to think about the fact that this, because of the interest in segmentation, market has facilitated, there's a market for traditionalism. And certainly within the South Asian context, we see a market for traditionalist life, in a sense. We see schools that support traditionalist learning. We see products for the traditionalist elite. We see a lifestyle which is, against a certain kind of consumerism, yet nevertheless segmented by the market. And so I want to ask, mostly as a, I guess, provocation or as a polemical question, what is wrong with the market segmentation of traditionalism, of allowing a certain space for traditionalism, containing it but allowing it?
Well, there's nothing wrong with it. If you want to have a market, if you want to have, we're talking about now, it's purely speculative. I want to make, first of all, a distinction, as I said earlier on, between the fashion that markets allow, because in that sense that's segmented too. Fashion is segmented. Different kinds of, whether it's youth or it's affluent middle classes or whatever, all sorts of people have been targeted for different kinds of fashions which the market enables. What I want to say is that this is very different from the notion of embodied tradition. Because in embodied tradition, as I see it, as it were, the authority is carried by some notion of a training or of a development of a certain kind. Whereas this one allows you, of course, to consume as you like. Now, when you say, what's wrong with it? Look, you can have whatever you want. I'm simply trying to suggest that one can think of a situation where the question of the temporality of the market has profound implications for things we usually don't think of in that sense, and that is even democratic deliberation and so on. So that in that context, one has to be aware. You can live dangerously, of course you can. You can live as a circus motorcyclist and so on, and far be it from me to suggest you shouldn't do so. All I'm saying is that that's rather different from other ways of living, and I would suggest that that's more. That's worth thinking about a little more, rather than saying you must not have it. In any case, the kind of what I would suggest we need to think of, and look, I've just made an extremely superficial sort of sketch of how one might think of politics as well as political relations and negotiations, where you don't have to have a centralized authority. As in, we all know, in foreign relations, there is no overarching central authority which says yes or no. And even the United Nations is, even the United States is not that powerful always to say it effectively. So if you didn't have it even institutionally, you could have all sorts of possibilities. If some people wanted to have, the kind of marketized, what you call tradition, which is tradition in a slightly different sense, more than a slightly different sense from the one that I am trying to contrast. And when you say binary, I'm not sure, analytically, for some purposes, Humaira, I promise you, it's not a sin to use a binary always, okay? Sometimes, it's useful and sometimes it's even essential. But to use it constantly or in certain situations where it misleads one, it's better not to do it, right? So that's my view in general. The market, we know, interpenetrates the state in all sorts of ways, and the state is dependent on the market in all sorts of ways, sometimes much more than at other times. That's quite true. And the market provides all sorts of things. Some things which one thinks of very positively, other things which one regrets. And the question is, what else does the market do in terms of its temporality. Actually, something that that my friend David Scott has written about recently in a book on questions of temporality and time in another context, very provocatively and thoughtfully. And that's what I'm trying to suggest is really something which we tend to overlook, and what the consequences of that are for political being within whatever kind of arrangement we might have. We live in a world of states. You know, I can't imagine this, in the near future the state disappearing. I can imagine global warming overcoming us much more quickly than the nation state. And there are all sorts of situations which it seems one can't do very much about. And within a nation state, I think one ought to be a little more alert to some of those things. Before you get my paradise of, commonwealths where people are just attached in different ways for different purposes and so on and overlapping. Before you get that, you have this bloody state, and you have to live in it somehow. And if you're lucky, you'll be in a state which allows some kind of activity. If you're not, then you are in, I don't know what the exact situation in Pakistan is, but in Egypt or whatever, that sort of thing. But one must think about what this does to the possibilities of politics. That's all I'm saying, and I'm saying that one should think a little more deeply and systematically about it than one does. So it's not just a question of opposition to a particular state we don't like, but what is it about the nature of cultural formation? And the formation may not be, indeed, market formation isn't a systematic, disciplined one, in the sense of monastic discipline or Sufi discipline or whatever it might be, but nevertheless it has an important constructive effect. And of course we know that there are accidents. People don't realize what they're choosing and don't want to choose the bad things and so on that come to them. But I think we ought to think about this much more seriously than we do, is partly. And thinking about it in terms of tradition, I think, helps. It certainly helped me because it, alerted me to questions of temporality and how one relates to temporality, and what can be done, and what the dangers are of certain kinds of imposed temporalities, in which accidents of all kinds can happen. And yes, even bricolage and so on, as somebody rightly said the other day. That's perfectly possible too, but it is different, and it has both its pleasant sides and its dangers. I don't know whether I've completely answered you, but anyway.
Good morning, good afternoon. Sorry, I have read The Road to Mecca by your dad, Muhammad Asad, lately, and I noticed how the Arab and Islamic world was much different and much united before Sykes-Picot and Balfour, Wa'ad Balfour. I think that all the consequences that went lately in the last century were the consequences of these two Wa'ad Balfour and Sykes-Picot. But I think also for Islamic politics entering the Islamic world, that like Dr. Fahmi Hawadi wrote 2 years ago in an article on Al Jazeera titled "Tahrim Demokratiya ala al-Islamiyyin." I think that even the war on Gaza last month was a proof that there is a coalition between the rich countries supporting Israel, even Arab countries as UAE and KSA, to topple the Islamic politics, to topple it down, because they know that Islam has a rigid way of providing freedom to people and providing prosperity and freedom of thought, that the dictatorships that was created by the Western and aided by the Western, that they do not want their people and population to have the freedom that Islamic politics provide for the population. I think this is what I resulted during my discourse on this topic. What is your opinion on this?
Well, thank you very much. Well, my brief opinion is that so long as you have a sovereign state, you're going to have some demand for some kind of what I call a singular personality of the state, and others will be marginalized within it. My own preference is neither for an Islamic state nor for a secular state. But you know what my preferences are neither here nor there. But this is what's going to happen. One way or another, there will be a slide towards parties or populations and so on that want to impose and say, you know, Egypt is essentially secular, or Egypt is essentially Islamic, or whatever it may be. As for the division, this is true, but you yourself say, look, all these Arab countries are supporting Israel and so on. You know, I mean, it's not only the West. There's something profoundly wrong about certainly our governments who are able to do this kind of association and undermining of people who are threatened, like the Gaza situation and so on, and helping Daesh now to kill all sorts of people, other Muslims who say they are Muslims, and Christians and Yazidis and so on. I mean, this is quite extraordinary, and it's the Arab states who are doing it. It's the Muslim states who are doing it. So I wouldn't. You know, I mean, I'm fully aware of what the Sykes-Picot Agreement was, and of the Balfour Declaration, and the fact that the European powers have been constantly intervening and, very importantly, exerting various kinds of pressure. That's obvious. But there is something also profoundly wrong about the way in which not just our governments, and I want to say something about our societies too, and not just to say this is a governmental issue. And I don't think that just modernizing, you know, talking about these countries not being adequately modernized, which really is, I think, a nonsensical phrase. It's not really an explanation, and in any case, I don't agree with that. I think that if you want to just talk about blame, then there's a lot of blame on the Arab states as well. A lot of blame on the way they operate. But that's, anyway. That looks like...
Thank you, Talal, for that very amazing talk, and for making us think in tandem with your earlier piece on the anthropology of Islam. I wanted to ask you about the conditions that you outlined that are necessary for the reproduction of an embodied tradition. And I'm recalling here Alistair McIntyre's argument about the demise of tradition, particularly of certain kind of, he doesn't use embodied, but he talks about virtuous tradition with virtues, and how modernity makes that impossible. And in various writings, he then thinks about the conditions within modernity that might be able to sustain it and reproduce it. And one of the places where he goes to is the smallness of institutions that can preserve, that do not turn into bureaucracies, that do not render themselves into market rationalities and so on. And so I'm thinking of that as I'm hearing you, and I'm just wondering if that's how you would distinguish the kind of argument you're making, because in a sense you're saying that embodied tradition is impossible to sustain, whereas McIntyre starts to think about conditions that could sustain that within the structure of the modern state and capitalism.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible. This is sort of a modern monasticism, if you like, what he talked about. I don't think it's possible. In the world that we have, with the kind of crises that we have, the crises of, of the environment, of the global financial system, of world militarism, nuclear power. I mean, I think that everything is being threatened, and I'm not going to predict anything, but all I'm saying is that I can't see that as a viable alternative. Because so much is now caught up. You can certainly have people trying to go up to the mountain, as even in the United States, and have little communes and so on, in which they can try and preserve something. But I think that the world that we are now faced with is, it may just be my old age, is so horrific that I really find it very difficult to see how anything like that can be preserved. In theory, and which I mentioned, an Islamic tradition, Christian traditions, or whatever it may be, might be, or even non-religious, in quotes, traditions may be developed. But I can't see that other form really developing. I mean, it's just a sort of a dream that one has. I don't think that it's on the cards. So I think that MacIntyre's notion of preserving something somewhere for a time when it will become again viable isn't plausible to me. I think that the systems, the global systems we now have, are just so all-encompassing, and the state, with its determination to control things, is so encompassing that it really, I think, won't be able to. But I may be wrong. I hope I'm wrong.
I think we've exhausted our guests sufficiently for the day. I want to reiterate our thanks to the panelists, Provost Ahmed Dalal, Professor David Scott, and of course, Professor Talal Asad. Thank you.